The job of the Attorney General of the United States is to enforce laws that protect the rights of each and every American. More than ever, we need leaders who can bring Americans together to improve police-community relations, to ensure that all Americans have access to the ballot, and to reform our criminal justice system. In the city in which I live, in Cleveland, we are under a consent decree today, which already is improving relations between the police and the community. We saw it more than a decade ago in Cincinnati, where Mayor Cranley, as then a member of council, now the mayor, has worked with the community and have others. We see more people of color in the police department. We see better training for police. We see improved relations in that community, in large part because the community came together. Police, community leaders, citizens, to make for better relationships and better relations inside the community. The consent decree there made a huge difference in that city. The consent decree in Cleveland is making a difference there. And that's partly the job of the Attorney General, to make sure the Department of Justice stays on course to do that. When we think of leaders whom we need to improve police community relations and to assure Americans have access to the ballot and reform our criminal justice system, Senator Sessions is simply not that leader. It's not personal. I've worked with Senator Sessions on issues like trade. We have strong, you actually even told him that if he had been nominated as a trade representative, I would happily vote for him. But we have strong policy differences on the issues that directly fall under the role of the Attorney General. I examined his nearly 40-year record as a U.S. attorney, the Attorney General of Alabama, a U.S. senator, and based on that record, I was the first in the Senate to say that I cannot support his nomination. I told Senator Sessions that on the floor of the Senate after I made that decision before I announced it. I have serious concerns that Senator Sessions' record on civil rights is at direct odds with the task of promoting justice and equality for all. And what's more important in an Attorney General than that? Senator Sessions has a history of racial insensitivity, bias against immigrants, disregard for the rule of law, hostility to the protection of civil rights. Exactly what we don't need in the Attorney General of the United States of America. He condemned the Department of Justice's investigation of law enforcement agencies accused of violating civil rights. He voted against the Violence Against Women Act, one issue after another that disqualify from being the Attorney General of the United States. Senator Sessions is wrong on voting rights. As a former Secretary of State, I served as Secretary of State of Ohio in the 1980s. I take voting rights very seriously. I believe we should be doing everything we can to make it easier for Americans to vote. And in those days, in the 1980s, during the Reagan years in Washington, in Ohio, voter registration, voter outreach, aggressive enrollment of new people to vote, of young people, of people regardless of political affiliation, regardless of ideology, regardless of age and race and income, we encouraged people to vote. We had good cooperation from Republicans and Democrats alike in the legislature. One thing we even did was I approached the McDonald's Corporation, asked them to print tray liners. They print tray liners on every tray when you go to McDonald's and order food. I asked them to print the voter registration form on tray liners. They printed 1 million voter registration form tray liners, resulting in thousands and thousands of voter registrations, some perhaps with ketchup stains on them or mustard stains, but nonetheless, voter registration forms that were accepted by local boards of elections. Utility companies include voter registration forms in their bills. Newspapers printed them in their daily papers so people could tear them out, fill them out, and send them in. That was what we did for aggressive voter outreach, supported by people all across the political spectrum. But Senator Sessions doesn't seem to agree with that kind of voter outreach. He has a history of supporting voter ID laws that make it harder to vote. He refused to disavow President Trump's false statement, provably false. Lots of people may believe it because President Trump said it, but provably false statement that there were 3 to 5 million illegal votes this past election. No evidence, just assertions, just demagoguery, just lies. But Senator Sessions was unwilling to disavow his perhaps future bosses' comments? Do you want an attorney general, the chief law enforcement official, that's going to let the president go out and make statements like that are provably false, call them what they are, lies from the president of the United States? Do you want an attorney general that's simply going to just brush those away and pay no attention? Senator Sessions called Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted a key part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, good news for the South, even though overwhelmingly senators in both parties had voted to renew and reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. He called it good news for the South to weaken protections for people of color and others in voting rights. Since that misguided decision, states across the country have passed new voting restrictions that would disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of Americans. Texas acted within 2 hours, as Senator Sessions apparently was celebrating by saying, good news for the South. Texas moved within 2 hours of the decision. Alabama, taking their cue from people like Senator Sessions, acted the next day to restrict voting rights. As soon as the court moved in a way the court hadn't moved in 5 decades, state after state began to restrict voting rights because they had license to, because they had a green light, because they had now legal authority, something they hadn't had in 50 years. At least 17 states have passed new voting restrictions since the Shelby County decision. Although my state wasn't covered by it, my state shamefully is one of those that has restricted voting rights. Even though in the 80s into the 90s, people of both parties joined me in wanting to expand voting rights and make sure that everybody, regardless of disability or age or gender or race or nationality or income, was able to vote. We know who's hurt most by these laws, and there's political reason for it. We know who's hurt most. It's African Americans, it's Latinos, it's young people, it's seniors. Just happened to be, the political reason just happened to be the voters who potentially might vote against the far right, which has lobbied hard on after the decision to scale back voting rights. Senator Sessions called the Voting Rights Act intrusive. Tell that to Congressman Lewis, who was beat up walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in Senator Sessions' state, who risked his life numbers of times, who was injured more probably than anybody in the civil rights movement, including in his home state of Alabama, Congressman Lewis's, now Congressman Lewis, Senator Sessions' home state of Alabama. Senator Sessions knows what happened to secure those voting rights for African Americans in his state. He was a young man at the time and saw what happened in the 50s and Rosa Parks and John Lewis in the 50s and the 60s. And still, he calls the Voting Rights Act intrusive. And I remember in my state, in 2004, people had to wait 6 hours in Lorain County to vote. In Knox County, people had to wait 9 hours to vote. And in the people that penalizes the most are not people of higher income who tend to have a little more flexibility in their schedule. It's working families who can't take time off work, who can leave work during lunch, go vote, go back to work. If they have to wait more than 30 or 40 or 50 minutes or an hour, they often can't do it. That have to pick up their kids, where daycare is expensive, and we know that many of them just give up and don't vote, which might just be the purpose of people behind the Shelby County versus Holder decision. 1981, when signing an extension to the Voting Rights Act, President Reagan called the right to vote the crown jewel of American liberties. President Reagan said it's the crown jewel of American liberties. Senator Sessions called the Voting Rights Act intrusive. Again, President Reagan said voting rights, signing the extension of the Voting Rights Act, the extension, a couple of extensions later that the court pulled back with Shelby County versus Holder. Keep that in mind. This President Reagan, and sometimes these pass the Congress unanimously. President Reagan said it was the crown jewel of American liberties. The Attorney General designee calls Voting Rights Act intrusive. We need an Attorney General who would use the full extent of his powers to protect the right to vote, not stand by as state after state attempts to suppress it. The Attorney General, as a senator, has stood by while the President of the United States has falsely simply lied about 3 to 5 million illegal voters. The Attorney General designee stood by, said nothing, was unwilling to criticize the President of the United States. I'm concerned that when state after state attempts to suppress the vote and roll back voting rights, that he will stand by and do nothing then because he called the Voting Rights Act intrusive. In criminal justice reform, we need to reform our criminal justice system, stop ruining the lives of far too many young black men over nonviolent offenses. Senator Sessions has opposed bipartisan efforts, and there have been a number of them and a number of courageous leaders in this body who have sometimes taken politically unpopular positions on criminal justice reform and done the right thing. Senator Sessions, however, has opposed bipartisan efforts at criminal justice reform. He called consent decrees. At the outset of my speech, I mentioned Cleveland and Cincinnati, where it's a decade and a half later has proven to be a success. Cleveland, where it's shaping up to be a success. He's called consent decrees that mandate reform of law enforcement agencies, quote, an end run around the democratic process. Reform of law enforcement agencies in many ways means better police training with real dollars and real effort put into that police training. Again, he calls all of this an end run around the democratic process. Senator Sessions blocked bipartisan efforts to reduce sentences for certain nonviolent drug offenses. Now, Mr. President, and there is surely a need for an independent attorney general, and that's my third sort of macro concern about my colleague Senator Sessions being elevated to be the Attorney General of the United States of America. In light of President Trump's cruel and foolish and badly executed executive order on immigrants and refugees, we need an Attorney General who will be an independent voice, beholden to the Constitution and the American people, not to the President. We've seen this order wreak havoc on Ohio's students and families. Cleveland father had waited 4 years to reunite with his 14-year-old son, forced to wait even longer when his refugee son was banned. We're a nation that embraces refugees. My son-in-law, at the age of 10, was living in El Salvador with his family. His mother was a journalist. His mother was the target of threats to her life because of the political violence in El Salvador. My son-in-law's family, he was 10, as I said, came to the United States and was welcomed in this country. We welcome refugees who are victims or potential victims or about to be victims of political violence or of violence of any kind. And that's what we are as a nation. My son-in-law, his family now, he's married to our daughter. They now have a son who's not much more than a year old. He's been a terrific citizen of this country. He's contributed a lot. We know that a great majority of refugees, when they come here, they build lives and they make a difference in the world, and they can live in a free, prosperous nation with opportunity. I mentioned the Cleveland father. I mentioned my son-in-law. A doctor on her way to the Cleveland Clinic to help treat Ohioans was sent back. She's finally, looks like she now has returned to the United States finally, after expensive legal issues and court and trauma and all the things that happen when somebody is pushed around by a system like that, with the arrogant White House inflicting that kind of pain on her and her family. Iraqis who risked their lives to American troops to help American troops have been told there's no place for you here. Think about that. A translator in Iraq, the first night after the executive order, a translator from Iraq, an Iraqi who had helped American troops and whose own life was threatened. He knew he had to leave his country because a number of people targeted people that helped the Americans. He came here. He was handcuffed for several hour after hour after hour at a New York airport. And what message does that send to people who help Americans, who help the American armed forces around the world? Students are prevented from coming to our state to learn and contribute at our great Ohio universities. We saw that at Ohio State. We're seeing that at other places. Judges across the country, appointed by Republican and Democratic presidents, are striking down this order because it's not constitutional. It doesn't represent American values. It makes us less, not more safe. Now, in 2015, Senator Sessions questioned Sally Yates at her confirmation to be Deputy Attorney General, asking her this question: do you think The Attorney General has the responsibility to say no to the president if he asks for something that's improper. Now, this is Senator Sessions asking an Obama nominee, do you think the Attorney General has the responsibility to say no to the president if he asks for something that's improper? He went on to say if he views the president wants to execute, if the views the president wants to execute are unlawful, should the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General say no? That was a Judiciary Committee hearing, confirmation hearing for Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, 2015. Ms. Yates responded, Senator, I believe the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General has an obligation to follow the law in the Constitution and to give their independent legal advice to the president, unquote. Senator Sessions then, to his credit, was right to ask that question. Sally Yates, to her credit, gave the right answer. And when she was tested just last week, she stood by her word. But Senator Sessions has failed to assure the American people he will follow the law and uphold the Constitution, not simply follow the President of the United States, not blindly follow the President of the United States just because he's his boss. That's not the kind of Attorney General we want. That's not the kind of Attorney General we should vote to confirm today. One last point, Mr. President. I watched the confirmation yesterday of the Secretary of Education. And it was so clear to me and so clear to so many of my colleagues and so clear to the American public that confirming the Secretary of Education, now the Secretary of Education, she was in an unprecedented historical move. The Vice President actually was the one that came in and broke the tie 51-50. Two Republicans stood up and voted against the Secretary of Education designee, showing great courage. But what was so evident, even though overwhelming opposition to her, our mail and phone calls and email were 200-1 maybe against her confirmation, it was that way everywhere in the country. And in senator's office after senator's office, we all were hearing much more opposition to her than support. But I sensed the fear among my colleagues among my Republican colleagues that voting against the Trump nominee put their political lives at risk. That they all knew that President Trump would tweet about their vote, would call them names, would attack them, would sic his political allies on them. And a number of my colleagues were scared. And they knew that voting against her confirmation, even though I know a number of colleagues wanted to vote no on Betsy DeVos because she was singularly unqualified, one of the worst performances ever in a confirmation hearing. She knew so little about either the issue of education and so little about the issue of education, so little about the department of which she was charged to run. Nonetheless, they voted for her. Some voted for her for legitimate reasons in their mind. They like her ideology. They like her for-profit charter schools. They're anti-public education, all those things. But a number of my colleagues, I'm convinced, voted for her because they were afraid of what the President of the United States would do. And you can't run a country by being fearful of the President of the United States. And I'm afraid, Mr. President, that in this Attorney General vote, we're seeing some of the same fear from some of my Republican colleagues, that standing up to this president, which they will eventually do, but they're unwilling to do it now. That's why we've only seen two senators, Senator Murkowski and Senator Collins, two Republican senators vote no on any of these nominations. And I voted for about half of them, voted against about half of them. I plan to vote against Congressman Price because he wants to raise the eligibility age of Medicare. I think about the barber in Warren and the factory worker in Mansfield and the waitress at a diner in Fenley and working a manufacturing worker in Huber Heights. I know they shouldn't be expected to work until they're 67 or even 70 to be eligible for Medicare. I will vote against him. I will vote against Mr. Mnuchin, who lied to the committee first about a $100 million investment he had, which he forgot about. An understandable problem. Of course, people forget about $100 million investments they have. And he lied to the committee about some of the things he did at One West, a bank. I mean, a whole host of these nominees simply aren't qualified and their ethics are questionable. But I've not seen Other than Senator Murkowski and other than Senator Collins, I've not seen any of my Republican colleagues, out of fear of this president personally attacking them publicly and personally, I have seen them shrink back from doing their constitutional duty and voting their conscience. I hope maybe today, maybe in Senator Sessions' vote, which I believe will be tonight, that some of my Republican colleagues will realize they need to do their jobs. They need to stand up for what they believe when they realize this Attorney General designee, Senator Sessions, a colleague I like personally, but a colleague that's simply not prepared. He's not independent. He's not had a record of support for voting rights, for criminal justice reform, all the things that we want in the Attorney General of the United States of America. I plan to vote no today. I ask my colleagues to join me.